Welcome back to World Religions. This video series is intended to accompany the textbook A Short Introduction to World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge and published by Fortress Press. It would also work well as an accompaniment to any semester-long survey of world religions course. Chapter 6, Religions of Antiquity. We can look at human religion being as old as humanity itself, going back to the Paleolithic or Old Stone and Mesolithic or Middle Stone ages. Humans and also other pre-human species of hominids have practiced rituals for at least 500,000 years. At the time, all of these species were hunter-foragers, so this is before the invention of farming and raising domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, or goats. An example of ritual activity from the Stone Age is the Venus of Willendorf and other similar so-called Venus figurines. The Venus of Willendorf in particular dates to around 25 to 30,000 years BP or before the present year. The Neolithic or New Stone Age period is characterized by the continuation of stone tools. There was some metalworking, but most tools and weapons were still made of stone. But the development of agriculture, which enabled humans to settle in larger villages. The oldest known stone monumental structure created by humans is at the site of Göbekli Tepe in what's now Turkey. It dates to around 9500 to 8000 BC, and it provides evidence of more complex ritual activity. This is a large stone shrine at which many animals, for example, appear to have been sacrificed to gods or spirits. In the Bronze Age and Iron Ages, humans developed metallurgy or metalworking, and most tools and weapons became made out of bronze or iron, respectively. This is also the origin of civilization, i.e., humans building cities or larger towns with larger populations. If you look at the religion, this is overlapping with the beginning of history, where we have some historical records, some texts, because Mesopotamia and Egypt, these old Bronze Age civilizations, developed some of the first systems of writing that we have. If you look at what they said about their gods, they're often arranged in hierarchical families. Sometimes the social structure of the gods with kings and queens models those of the ancient human cultures that we see in the Bronze and Iron Ages. The gods were often served by priests at temples. These would be people who were trained specifically as priests. Oftentimes it was their only or main occupation. Most of the religions, though, were not what we classify today as missionary religions. So religion was something that was a part of the culture, like their language. And just as they wouldn't necessarily seek to deliberately spread their language to other cultures, a lot of these ancient civilizations didn't deliberately seek to spread their religion to other cultures. Sometimes the worship of a particular god or goddess would indeed spread to other cultures, but it was rarely by design, rarely out of a missionary impulse, you might say. You can contrast that with later religions such as Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. Also, the Bronze Age and Iron Age religions didn't generally require like an intense personal commitment to a god or goddess or relationship with. People would pray to their gods and goddesses, and since they would have some kind of relationship to them, but you really see this emphasis on that personal commitment, that personal relationship, and a god or goddess as a personal savior that develops in the first few centuries BC. The religion had both a public as well as private aspects to it. The public aspect was often directed or influenced by the king or other government, and the rulers would often promote public festivals, such as the Pan-Athenaic Festival in the city of Athens. To a large extent, religion was something that people participated in just in virtue of being a member of the culture, although people would also maintain altars at their home. Folk religion existed alongside state religion, and folk religion tended to have a lot of variability to it. The same gods and goddesses, for example, would be worshipped throughout the ancient Greek city-states, but they would often have local variations. And some people would also respect, fear, or even worship gods of other cultures. It wasn't that uncommon. So, just as by analogy, one culture might borrow words from another on occasion when that seemed useful, they would sometimes also borrow gods or goddesses. People would generally worship many gods and goddesses, as well as more local spirits of particular places, just as the need arose. So if they were sick, they might pray to a god of healing, for example. If they were going to get married, they might pray to a god of marriage. Most ancient religions were eventually replaced by those missionary religions, with a few exceptions. So Vedic religion or Hinduism did evolve and change over the millennia, but it's still the predominant religion in South Asia or the modern nation of India. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia, is still around as well. It wasn't completely replaced by Islam, although it was mostly replaced by Islam in its homeland of Persia, now the modern nation of Iran. You can see on this map of prevailing world religions that the largest areas are taken up by green, which is Islam, and the various types of Christianity. Red is Catholic Christianity, blue is Protestant Christianity, and purple is Orthodox Christianity. There also is a significant part of Central, Southeast, and East Asia taken up by Buddhism, which is shown by yellow and ochre. The pink areas are those of traditional East Asian religions, which often are a mix of Buddhism and other traditions. Like in China, you have Buddhism mixed with Taoism. In Japan, Buddhism mixed with Shinto, for example. But you can see, in other words, there's only a few of these large missionary religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, that take up most of the nations of the world. The diversity of religions for each particular culture or civilization had its own religion, its own customs, that has largely disappeared. So now we're going to go through several different historical periods and civilizations and try to quickly summarize some of the main features of their religion. We're going to start with the prehistoric period in general. Prehistory just refers to that period of time before humans had written records. And this could include even pre-human hominid species like Homo erectus. The version of Homo erectus found in what's now China, called Peking man, has skulls from 600 to 700,000 years BP that appear to be broken in parts to give access to the brain. This is speculative, but the brains may have been eaten, and some scholars have proposed that this was showing some kind of ritual significance. For example, later human cultures would sometimes eat the brains of other humans as a way of absorbing their spiritual power. Again, this is speculative, but it's at least a possible ritual use. The Neanderthals were another early hominid species who went extinct around 40,000 years BP. And there's actually evidence, genetic evidence, that they did some interbreeding with humans. Neanderthals buried their dead with ceremonies or rituals and appear to have offered grave gifts. Bears or other animals may also have been worshipped by some Neanderthal communities. In terms of early human or Homo sapiens ritual, we see evidence of it in burials, such as in France and Russia, that are similar to those of Neanderthals, and that we find human bodies buried with valuables. You can see an example of this from Sungir, Russia, in the slide on the right. This dates from around 30,500 to 30,000 years BC. There are also extensive cave paintings in southern France and northern Spain. These may have had a religious function, such as to increase the chance of success when hunting. We can compare in this manner depictions of animals within more recent societies, such as buffalo dances by Plains Indians. The picture on the right is from a cave in France, the most famous one, Lascaux, and dating to around 17,000 years BP or before present. And then finally, we can point to stone figures such as the aforementioned Venus of Willendorf. These may have served some sort of fertility function to increase the fertility of humans or just of the land generally. The Neolithic period begins around 10,000 BC and continues to different years in different places, just depending on when they developed metallurgy and bronze or iron tools. During the Neolithic period, humans started to settle in larger villages. They used polished stone tools, but they became farmers. And the picture on the right is a model of Çatalhöyük from what is now Turkey. This is a very old Neolithic village from around 7000 BC. At Çatalhöyük and other Neolithic sites, inhumation or burial underground after death became the norm. Small figurines are often left with the deceased bodies. Presumably, they might have functioned as servants in the afterlife. We also have some remains of temples or shrines and possible evidence of the origins of priests. Having a priest who does that as a special job or occupation goes along with the general idea of specialization and division of labor that happened as societies became more complex. So when you have like agricultural surpluses of food, whether of crops or domesticated animals, it enables some people to focus less on food production as their primary labor, but to do other things such as crafts or indeed becoming a priest. There's a site in Russia that has a large altar at the center of a temple and a large clay chair, which was presumably used by a priest or some sort of ritual officiant. The picture on this slide is the reconstruction of a shrine room at the site of Çatalhöyük, which features skulls of bulls that have been partially given a clay face. And obviously, these have some kind of ritual significance, presumably worshiping some god associated with the bull. There also are a lot of megalithic or large stone monuments dating from the Neolithic era that are interpreted as temples. These are often linked with nearby burial sites. They often also have astronomical associations, such as having certain features that align with the solstices, where the sun would appear on the horizon at the summer or the winter solstice. Development of astronomy, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars, was probably associated with the development of agriculture, in part because of the correlations between the motions of the heavenly bodies and the seasons. And these correlations can be used to help time things such as the planting of seeds and the harvest. A famous example of a Neolithic megalith is Stonehenge in England, which was built around 3100 BC and after. The Neolithic, i.e., the farming culture, came to the British Isles later than in other parts of Europe, but they did have the same practices of building large stone monuments. Ancient Near Eastern religion. The ancient Near East, the term is somewhat ambiguous, but it can cover what's now known as the Middle East. So countries like Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, the northern parts of Arabia, as well as the southeastern parts of Turkey. This is the location of the oldest or one of the oldest civilizations, Sumer, which is in what is now southern Iraq. An older name or historical name for the region around Sumer is Mesopotamia, which is Greek for between the rivers. The two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates, and many civilizations originated in long river valleys like this because they provided an area in which agriculture could be practiced on a large scale, thus building up surpluses of food for villages. Villages linked through trade create towns and cities, and so on. One thing to note about the map on the right is you'll see that the original coastline in antiquity was different from the modern coastline. It was further inland than it is now, and the deposits of dirt and silt by the rivers have gradually built up the land, so now the coastline is further to the east. The map also shows some of the main cities of Sumer, including Uruk, Ur, and Lagash. So the Sumerians had a type of writing called cuneiform. This was developed to help organize factors such as irrigation, farming, taxation, trade, and so on. The picture on the right is of an early form of cuneiform called proto-cuneiform. You can see the images that served as the basis of the writing quite clearly, such as a hand or a sheaf of grain. There were temples called ziggurats, which are pyramid-like step temples that were at the center of the Sumerian cultures. So these were the centers of the cities, and they were kind of like the political as well as the religious focus. There were often kings who served as priests, or priests who worked very closely with kings and helped sort of govern the city-state, govern the society. So Sumer was not politically united early in its history. Each city was kind of its own independent mini state. An example of a famous ancient ziggurat is the White Temple at Uruk. And it was built in two phases. You can see the modern remnants of the later phase in the picture at top. The Sumerians believed in many gods and goddesses, and they had many myths about them. Anu was the original king of the gods, and the queen of the gods was Inanna, a fertility goddess. Another important god was Enki, who was god of water, wisdom, crafts, and also he was regarded as a creator god. And Enlil was the god of air, wind, and storms, who was also very important. Anu and Inanna had two of the main temples in the city of Uruk, and oftentimes each god would have their primary temple in one of the Sumerian cities. They would tend to be worshipped by all the cities, but many cities would choose one god or goddess as their patron. And that was one of the main reasons why that god's main temple would be in one city rather than another. Eventually, theologians would record the roles of each god and write them in lists. And later on, some of these lists were used to correlate Sumerian gods with that of later cultures from the region. There were also official poets who served the kings of the different city-states who would tell stories of the gods, i.e., myths, probably set to musical accompaniment. The picture is a relief of the goddess Inanna on the right receiving offerings from a worshipper on the left. This is from Uruk and dates to 3200 to 3000 BC. The most famous Sumerian myth is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the story of the legendary king who was supposed to have lived around 2700 BC. There were several earlier Sumerian versions and a standardized later Babylonian version, which was edited and modified to focus on a single theme, the king Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. In the image on the right, you can see Gilgamesh and his companion in arms, Enkidu, slaying a creature called the Bull of Heaven. The context for this image is that Gilgamesh had earlier insulted the goddess Inanna, calling her sexually promiscuous and someone who essentially betrayed the various heroes or kings that she would have sexual relations with. Inanna was insulted. She went to the king of the gods and got the king of the gods to send the bull of heaven down to destroy Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but they were able to defeat and kill the bull of heaven. However, Enkidu went one step further, throwing a leg or part of the leg of the bull up in defiance at the gods, for which they cursed him to death. After Enkidu was cursed to death, Gilgamesh mourned. He went on a long quest, or really a series of quests, to try to get immortality because he was so afraid and disturbed by the prospect of his own mortality, his own death. He eventually met a fellow named Utnapishtim, who was the original sole human survivor of the Great Flood. And Utnapishtim told Gilgamesh the story of the flood, which is recorded separately in this Atrahasis epic. You can see a cuneiform version of it on the right. In the Sumerian story of the Great Flood, the god Enki warned Utnapishtim of the coming flood and told him to build a large boat on which he, his family, and a variety of animals could survive. This is obviously similar in outline to the Hebrew Bible's story of Noah and Noah's Ark, and we can speculate that either the ancient Israelites were influenced by the stories of Utnapishtim that were circulating throughout the Near East, or that they were both descended from an even more ancient common source. It's very common to see parallels in myths and stories from different cultures. Whenever you do see parallels, though, you have to ask yourself, were they invented independently or did one influence the other? And it's not always obvious what the case is, but in terms of the Noah story and the Utnapishtim story, because ancient Israel was so close to Sumeria and Mesopotamia, it's likely that they did not arise entirely independently. Diviners are priests whose job is to read omens, i.e., to practice divination, to predict the future, or to get hidden or secret information that is useful to people. There are many different methods of divination, even just the ones practiced in ancient Sumer. For example, augury is divination based on the flight of birds, and they had other types of divination for the movements of other animals as well. Examining cracks in a wall. This is perhaps similar to the modern practice of palmistry, looking at cracks in the skin of a person's hand. So we're taking patterns that form in nature essentially randomly and trying to read significance into them. Another very common type of divination in ancient Mesopotamia is haruspicy, which is examining the liver of a sacrificed animal. You can see in the picture on the right models of livers made of clay that could be used for divination purposes by these diviners. Also, astrology and astronomy were very important in ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian culture. There was no real sharp line between astrology and astronomy as a science. They were essentially one and the same. The stars, planets, and sun and moon were interpreted as gods, and their motions were thought to influence affairs on the earth. In fact, the fact that there are 7 days of the week and each of those days was named after a god, that's based ultimately in the Sumerian astrology. And this is based off of the 7 planets that can be observed with the naked eye: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, these are the modern English names for those heavenly bodies, some of them derived from Roman gods. But in Sumeria, they had their own gods that they associated with each of those planets or wandering celestial bodies. Pre-Columbian Central and South America. So Central and South America were the source of civilization in the New World, in the Americas. The migration of humans to the Americas may have happened in multiple waves. So on the slide is shown one model that basically shows two main waves of migration into the Americas, both through the north. So one started around 25,000 years ago, and the other more recently, 5,000 years and before. Civilizations in Central and South America get started much later, around 1200 BC and onward. So those civilizations that arose in the Americas not quite as old as Sumer or Egypt in the Old World, which date to around 3000 BC and after. But still, if we take 1200 BC as the starting point of civilization in the Americas, that's over 3000 years of age, so still quite ancient. The Olmecs are the oldest civilization in Central America, and they were in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. You can see on the map some of the central sites associated with the Olmecs. Their religion was focused on worshiping the jaguar god. They worshipped the jaguar. There's carvings of jaguars and jaguar hybrids that are part bird or part snake or part human. There's also a carving of a jaguar embracing a woman. This is connected to a myth of creating human jaguar hybrids, often called were jaguars or literally man jaguars, which may have been gods of fertility. The statue on the right is a possible depiction of a were jaguar found at Tenochtitlan, one of the primary Olmec sites. This is an old one that dates to around 1200 and 900 BC. Many pre-Columbian religions did feature animals combined, like different types of animals combined to form one figure, one god. A later example is Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent of Aztec religion. The Olmec jaguar god, in fact, may have been believed to be the ancestor of Quetzalcoatl. After the Olmecs, the next main phase of Central American civilization was that of the Maya. The Mayan culture and language continues to this day, but their civilization, in terms of their large stone monumental cities, died out before the coming of the Aztecs. So they date basically from 200 BC and afterward. They're a kind of successor civilization to the Olmecs. You see the Olmecs, the Maya, and the Aztecs as three main phases of the civilization of pre-Columbian Central America. You can see from the map on the right that they had a very wide-ranging civilization, including modern nations of Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala. Mayans looked at religion as a kind of contract between humans and the gods. The gods would provide food, they would provide nourishment, such as maize, i.e., corn, but conditional on humans providing sacrifice. So the gods will only give humans food if humans first give them maize, animals, or indeed human blood. So the Maya practiced extensive human sacrifice, and the method was holding the victim down and extracting their heart from them while they were still alive. In the picture is the Mayan maize god, the god of corn, of grain, but he's performing the work of a scribe. So he was also the patron of the scribes, the very same class of people who would have drawn images such as this. Teotihuacan was the greatest Mayan temple city, and it flourished from around 300 to 700 AD. Many of these cities had a large temple structure at their heart. This was a religion that was promoted by the rulers, by the state, by the government. And that form of the religion was indeed central to Mayan society. That was the form of the religion connected to the human sacrifice, for example. So there was often a theocratic system of government where priests or priest kings would be the rulers. The third main phase of Central American civilization was that of the Aztecs. These were people who originally from the north, outside of Central America. They migrated to what's now the Valley of Mexico in the late 12th century AD. The map on the right shows the gradual expansion of their empire. They came to dominate a lot of these surrounding peoples. There were a few primordial gods of Aztec religion. Ometecutli, Lord of the Duality, and Omequixoatl, the Lady of the Duality. So this Lord and Lady created other gods who then in turn created the earth. Now, one of the gods created the sun through an act of self-sacrifice. So this pattern was copied by other gods to start the sun on its course throughout the sky. And this was connected to the Aztec belief that they had to continue human sacrifice in order to keep the sun on its course, to sort of maintain the cosmic order, so to speak. The Aztecs believed, in fact, that daily human sacrifice was needed to keep the sun rising and setting. And according to modern scholars, around 20,000 people, most of whom were captives gained from warfare, were sacrificed annually. A couple of the gods of the Aztecs, there were many. Quetzalcoatl, the plumed or feathered serpent. He was god of the wind, but also of merchants, arts, crafts, and knowledge. One of the most important Aztec gods. You can see him in the picture on the left. Another one was Mictlantecuhtli, god of the death, really god of the land of the dead, which was Mictlan. So that was the destination of everyone when they died. So he served as kind of a ruler and judge of the dead. The Inca was the civilization of South America, at least the main one that we know about. More recently, there have been discoveries of large structures and apparent cities in the Amazon, what's now the Amazon, but those have not been fully excavated nor studied as extensively as the Inca. So the Inca were a later civilization. They created an empire that extended across the Andes Mountains, so they controlled most of what is the modern nation of Peru. And you can see the expansion of the Inca Empire shown on the map on the right. The most important god of the Inca was Inti, the sun god. He was believed to protect and help the crops grow and mature. Sacrifice of corn beer, food, or llamas, the main domesticated animal of the Inca, were given to Inti. The picture on the right shows a king of the Inca, Pachacuti, worshiping Inti. And this was an Incan king from around the time of the Spanish contact and conquest of the Incas. The Spanish conquest of Central and South America was a gradual process, starting with the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492, and the real invasion and conquest of the Aztec and Incan Empire starts around 1532 and after. Now, this was a kind of cataclysmic or catastrophic event in some ways for the indigenous societies. Their religions in particular were mostly destroyed as a result of the wars, famines, and diseases, and later assimilation to the Spanish language and Catholic Christianity. Nevertheless, aspects of the pre-Columbian religion and culture survive. For one thing, a lot of the pre-Columbian languages, like the language of the Mayans and of the Aztecs, the Nahuatl, survive in Mexico, for instance. Another example of a survival of the religion practices is the Day of the Dead festival in Mexico. Now, this is a Catholic Christian celebration, but in terms of the way it's celebrated, the manner, it seems to combine features from the Catholic All Souls Day festival with certain flavors or remnants of Aztec culture. The pre-Columbian religions can also be studied to understand pre-modern religions of Europe and the Middle East. This is true of other forms of animism and polytheism that survived more recently into modern times because they are much better documented, much better understood than the religions that died out, for example, a couple thousand years ago in Europe or the Middle East. Ancient Egyptian religion. Ancient Egypt was focused on the valley of the Nile River. Civilization emerged there around 3100 BC and after. They grew a lot of wheat, that was their main crop, and they had other grains as well. So eventually they developed a system of writing, early form of hieroglyphics, and a centralized government. The main division that Egyptians themselves made of the land of Egypt was Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was in the north. It was lower because it was closer to the sea and the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta is the triangle-shaped fanning out of the Nile River as it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt was to the south. The land was higher. That's why the river flows downwards towards Lower Egypt. And these were both a part of the core of Egyptian civilization, but they originally were separate kingdoms. The state religion of Egypt was featuring many temples, many priests that were paid for, financially supported by the kings, by the pharaohs. People in ancient Egypt worshipped many gods based on the needs of the moment. And this is true of most polytheistic religions. And you can see a similar pattern of worship in the veneration of angels and saints in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, where it's customary to ask for the prayers of a particular saint, ask for their intercession, depending on what that saint is especially associated with. So similarly, in ancient Egypt, you would go to a different god based on your current needs. So some of the ancient Egyptian gods include Ra, the sun god, who is depicted as a hawk. Many Egyptian gods were theriomorphic, so they had an animal or part animal form. Another example is Bast, the cat goddess. And some actual animals were regarded as sacred in ancient Egypt, like cats in general were sometimes treated that way. Or individual animals could be regarded as incarnations of a god, most famously the bull of Apis. In some periods, animals were also mummified and placed in tombs. Examples have included baboons, crocodiles, ibises, a type of tall bird of the wetlands, and cats and dogs. You can see in the image of the god Ra on the left that there's a sun, a solar disk above his head. The worshiper, the woman on the right who's worshiping Ra, is being hit by these flower-like rays or strings. This is actually meant to symbolize rays of light shining from the sun onto the worshiper. And that light was thought of as connected to the kind of power and grace of the god. So kings theoretically performed all of the religious ceremonies in Egypt. Kings were the main intercessor, if you will, between the people and the gods. In actuality, there were many priests who performed most of the ceremonies as deputies or representatives of the king. But the priests as a class, even though they were nominally in service to the king, they did have considerable independent power. We can see this in the example of the pharaoh Akhenaten, originally named Amenopis IV. He renamed himself Akhenaten because he expanded the worship of the god Aten. And it's even possible that he intended his reform of the religion to be a kind of monotheism, where he only believed in one true God, or more likely, a type of monolatry where he only worshipped Aten. Even that is not totally clear, because even in Akhenaten's new capital that he built, there is sign of continued worship of other gods. But the point is, after the king, whose picture is shown on the right, tried to reform the religion in this way, the priests of other gods got together and undid a lot of his reforms, restored the traditional Egyptian religion under his son and heir Tutankhamun, who was dedicated to the god Amun. The priests of Amun were the main rivals in this power dispute between the Temple of Aten and the Temple of Amun. But it just shows you that despite the wishes of pharaohs, the priests could have independent power. Ancient Egyptian temples were often relatively plain on the exterior, but elaborate in the interior with lots of art and decoration. And the decoration, the paintings on the interior were often reflecting or even part of the rituals that took place inside. So you can see from the exterior picture on the right, this is of the temple of Isis, a goddess, at Philae, built in the 4th to 1st centuries BC. So there's these pylons or gates on the left side. They would have been in front of the outer courtyard. And then you pass through the outer courtyard to get to the inner sanctuary, which is on the right side of the temple. The overall pattern of this, by the way, is similar to the ancient temple of the Jews in Jerusalem. And the picture on the left shows a relief with painting from the sanctuary of Khonsu Temple at Karnak Temple. And so it just gives you an idea of the lavish decorations that would often adorn temple interiors. The Egyptians had many creation myths, and this was actually fairly common for traditional religions. Traditional forms of animism and polytheism didn't usually have one canon, one official set of texts, stories, or doctrines, so you would expect local variation as well as variation over time. So, in many of the Egyptian creation myths, though, the world begins when the sun rises over primordial waters of creation, and from those waters emerge a mound of earth, which is the earliest form of the world. And often there's a creator god involved who helps bring order to this watery chaos. You can see in the depiction on the right, the sun at the top is rising over the primordial waters of creation. There are a variety of creator gods in different versions of the myth. And one of them, the god Atum, who's the god of the evening sun, first created himself, then the gods Shu and Tefnut, who essentially mate and procreate the rest of the gods. In another creation myth, Ra, the god of the noonday sun, created the whole world by himself. Belief in the afterlife was a very important aspect of ancient Egyptian religion. You can see this in the myth of Osiris. Osiris was a god of greenery and vegetation. He was murdered by his brother Set, restored to life in part by his wife Isis, and he posthumously sired his son Horus. The ancient Egyptians had elaborate practices connected to burying the deceased in tombs. Even the earliest tombs from Egypt contained food and other items to help the deceased. Later, food, tools, weapons, and scrolls containing ritual incantations were often left in tombs to aid the deceased in their journey through the afterlife. The afterlife was thought of as a difficult journey with obstacles and demons blocking the route. Purpose of mummification was to preserve the body so the soul could continue to use it as a base as it underwent its afterlife journey. The journey of the afterlife culminated in a judgment of the soul. You can see this depicted on the right. The jackal-headed god Anubis, who's a kind of patron god of the deceased, weighs the heart of the deceased man Hunefer on the scale of Ma'at, which means justice or righteousness or cosmic order. And on the left is the heart of the deceased Hunefer. On the right is the feather of truth. The god Thoth, whose head is an ibis, records the result on the right. And as long as a person's heart was lighter than the feather of truth, then they would have a good afterlife, essentially. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was a religion that started in ancient Persia, and it's regarded as having been founded by a prophet named Zarathustra. The Greek name of Zarathustra is Zoroaster, and that's the one that became more commonly known in Western cultures. So Zarathustra may well have been a historical figure, but his dates are very obscure. He may have lived around 1200 BC, but you hear people give dates for him anywhere between 1500 and 500 BC. He's probably one of the oldest named prophets that we know of. And he's reported to have had the first of a series of visions around the age of 30. And so his religion that he founded is not entirely of whole cloth. You can look at it as a reform or modification of the previous ancient Persian religion. And so he uses new terms, he introduces new concepts, he has a different theology, but it's kind of a successor to the older presumed polytheism of the ancient Persians. You can see in the picture on the right, this is a modern 19th century depiction of Zarathustra from India, but it shows you how Zoroastrians today might think of Zarathustra as a figure. So, Zoroastrianism is an early example of prophetic religion. This is religion whose doctrines are revealed to a particular prophet, a named visionary. You can contrast this with the previous types of religion that you could call customary religions. These are ones that are just a part of the culture. People inherit them from their ancestors, but they're authored anonymously, as it were. They don't necessarily have a tradition of particular prophets or visionaries who created the knowledge of all of their gods and practices. But with prophetic religions like Zoroastrianism and like Judaism, whose prophets included Abraham and Noah and Moses and so on, these were religions that attributed their teachings and practices to some particular people. Zoroastrianism is also noteworthy for being an early example of a monotheistic religion. So Zoroaster advocated worshiping only one god, Ahura Mazda. Later Zoroastrians did worship other divine beings, so not all of them were strict monotheists, although Zoroastrians today are. But in any event, Zarathustra's original reform of the ancient Persian religion made it different from most of the other forms of polytheism that existed around him in the Near East at the time. So Zoroastrianism is still practiced today by the community known as the Parsis, who live in Mumbai, India. They were actually originally from Persia, hence the name Parsi. They migrated to India over 1,000 years ago after Persia was conquered by Muslims, and many of the Zoroastrians were pressured or forced to convert. There's also a small population of Zoroastrians in the nation of Iran today, which is essentially the modern name for Persia. Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion. They see the universe as an ongoing battle between two powers, two forces, good and evil. Ahura Mazda, or God, is the force of good. His name means the wise Lord. In later Zoroastrian texts, he's known as Ormuzd because the language of their scriptures evolved over time. Ahura Mazda was regarded as Zarathustra as having created the world, but the world was corrupted by Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit who was not of God's creation. So Angra Mainyu, later known as Ahriman, is a independent force not created by Ahura Mazda and essentially opposed to Ahura Mazda. You can see an ancient Persian depiction of Ahura Mazda in the picture on the right, which shows the god giving a diadem representing the right to rule, sovereignty, to the ancient Persian king Ardashir I. Zoroastrians believe that humans have free will. Ahura Mazda created humans to help him in the divine struggle against the evil god or evil being Angra Mainyu. Humans have a duty to farm, to grow food, and to have families, to assist in maintaining and expanding the creation. So humans always have a choice between whether they serve Ahura Mazda or Angra Mainyu, but of course Zarathustra says that the right choice is to serve Ahura Mazda. So free will can be conceived of in different ways. One way of thinking of it is just a power of choice or agency. So Zoroastrians believe that this is kind of an innate human faculty or feature. And so all humans, without exception, must make the choice between serving good or evil. In some respects, this makes Zoroastrianism more focused on the decisions of individuals and the individual's relationship to God or to goodness, as opposed to thinking of religion more as an essentially communal affair where society comes together either to constitute its identity or to perform contracts, covenants, or bargains with the gods. The symbol on the right is the Fravashi, which you could say represents the individual human soul, or it's often described as representing a guardian spirit that's attached to each individual human. The Zoroastrian view of the afterlife is one of divine judgment. So those who have good thoughts, who serve Ahura Mazda, they can go to heaven, whereas those who have evil thoughts, words, or deeds, they go to hell. They are punished. A much later Zoroastrian manuscript has this picture on the right where a dead person's deeds are being judged. In this case, their good deeds, shown by the golden platter, are outweighing the evil deeds shown by the black platter. And so presumably they're going to get a good afterlife in heaven. The priests of the Zoroastrians are often called magi, especially by Westerners and Western scholars. The actual situation of the priesthood in ancient Persia is somewhat complex, but it does appear there was a group of people who could be called magi who were sort of a hereditary tribe or class of priests. Now, there also appears to have been some historical evolution of the rituals, the ceremonies performed by Zoroastrianism, but many of them focus on a sacred fire and also on purifying water, using water to purify before entering a temple, for example. You can see from the ancient ossuary or a casket for holding bones shown in the picture on the right that they did practice the sacred hearth, the sacred fire in antiquity. You can see the sacred fire at the center on the bottom, and it's flanked by two priests, priests on either side, who wear a mask as part of the ceremony. The Magi are also referred to in the Christian gospel, one of the nativity stories of Jesus. In Christianity, they probably do represent Zoroastrian priests coming from the east, from Persia, but their appearance in the story is a signal of the fact that Zoroastrian priests were often regarded as very wise in the ways of astrology. Some of that learning they inherited from the Sumerians and the Babylonians after them. Zoroastrian temples often center around a sacred fire. So, for example, the fire temple of Yazd in Iran has an eternal flame. So, both fire and water were used to purify. While the origins of the role of the sacred fire in Zoroastrianism are somewhat unclear, for example, there isn't a lot of doctrine about the fire in the oldest Zoroastrian scriptures. Nevertheless, the centrality of the fire rituals in Zoroastrianism does suggest a connection with Vedic religion, which the earliest form of Vedic religion or Hinduism also focuses on giving offerings to a fire altar. This is no surprise since the ancient Persians have the same ethnic origin as the earliest Hindus. They both derive from the Aryans, a people who probably originated in what's now Central Asia, but migrated to various parts of South and Southwest Asia, including what is now India and Iran. The Achaemenid dynasty was the first great Persian empire, and it lasted from around 550 to 330 BC. Zoroastrianism was the official religion that was promoted by the emperors of the Achaemenid dynasty. The Magi class acted as royal chaplains, and they traveled with military and diplomatic delegations throughout the empire. So, in other words, Zoroastrianism was able to spread through missionary work performed by the Magi. Later on, however, the later Persian Empire, the Sasanians, were conquered by the early Muslim Caliphate, and Persia gradually became Muslim. It fell under Muslim domination between the years 632 and 654 AD. Zoroastrianism did survive at first, but gradually the population became more and more Muslim, and today there's only around 25,000 Zoroastrians who remain in the nation of Iran. As mentioned before, some ancient Zoroastrians did migrate to Mumbai or Bombay in India, where they are known as Parsis or Persians. There's around 115,000 of them today. Greek religion. Greek culture begins in the Bronze Age with what's known as Mycenaean Greece. This involved several independent city-states, or really they weren't large cities, but they were little kingdoms focused on palaces, usually made of stone, built by kings. So each king had their own palace, their own capital or headquarters, and they controlled the surrounding territory. And these palaces were usually fortified. Um, they did have writing. They had a type of script called Linear B, which wasn't deciphered until 1952. Before this time, scholars weren't even sure if the language that the Mycenaean Greeks spoke was related to the later Greek language. But after the Linear B script was deciphered, it was indeed discovered to be an archaic or older form of Greek. The religion of the Mycenaeans is not that well known, not as well known as later periods in Greek history, but there are tablets in Linear B script that contain references to ritual offerings, priests, and some gods, including gods we see in later Greek religion, like Poseidon, god of the sea, Athena, goddess of wisdom, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and Artemis, a goddess of hunting. But there are few permanent shrines or structures. One example of an artifact from Mycenaean Greece related to religion is the so-called Lady of Philokope, a ceramic figure of either a goddess or a priestess. Around 1200 to 1100 BC, there was an event known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. There was a series of disruptions and a bunch of the very advanced, very developed Bronze Age cultures of the Near East, and Greece was also swept up in this. Egypt was one of the only kingdoms or civilizations to survive. Another civilization, the Hittites, which is in what is now Turkey, to the north of Egypt, they were actually wiped out by a series of invasions and migrations. So the Bronze Age collapse effectively set the stage for the later development of the Iron Age, new kingdoms, new peoples, new religions. There was a very big disruption in Greece. All of the palace cultures collapsed. They actually lost the art of writing. And it wasn't until centuries later that they started to rebuild cities and to have writing again. So the period after the late Bronze Age collapse and before the development of classical Greece is known as the Greek Dark Ages. So early Greek religion and culture, you could say, dates to the period of the Greek Dark Ages or the Archaic period after that. Obviously, there are some elements that go back to the Mycenaeans too, but it was mainly after the Bronze Age collapse that what we think of as classical Greek culture developed. So two big elements in the religion and culture of the ancient Greeks were the epic poems known as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Both of these are attributed to the poet Homer, although he may have been a legendary figure. They're both stories set during or immediately after the Trojan War, which told of a great conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the city of Troy to the east. So these stories contain many depictions of the gods. The gods of Homer's epics have human-like motivations such as wrath, vengeance, love, justice, or decency. They are immortal, though, unlike humans. The humans in the Iliad and Odyssey often attempt to appease the gods through praise and sacrifice. So animal sacrifice, libations, pouring out of wine as offerings to the gods, those are the common types of worship portrayed in the Iliad and Odyssey. So we can assume they reflect the practices of the ancient Greeks from that period, which is around 800 BC or after. The humans are in the stories are also portrayed as having destinies that sometimes can't be avoided, like Achilles' destiny, the greatest of the heroes, the warriors of the Greeks, who's destined to die a warrior, die fighting, essentially. In the picture on the right, we see the hero Odysseus, hero of the Odyssey, as he's fleeing an island while being attacked by a one-eyed giant, the Cyclops Polyphemus, who you can see in the painting is throwing a large stone at him as Odysseus tries to flee in his ship with his men. Polyphemus was the son of the god Poseidon, god of the sea. And because Odysseus actually poked out the one eye of the Cyclops Polyphemus, Polyphemus asked his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, and the god Poseidon indeed does that, preventing Odysseus from getting to his home in the island of Ithaca. He has to wait for several decades before he's finally able to get home. So these epics, Iliad and the Odyssey, with their depictions of the gods and the gods' relations to humans, had a great influence on later Greek culture as well as its religion. You can look at the influence on literature and the arts. So there are many gods and goddesses worshipped in ancient Greece. The main group is known as the Olympians. These were the 12 gods who lived on Mount Olympus. Some of the main gods of the Olympians include Zeus, the king of the gods, his wife Hera, who is the goddess of motherhood and childbirth. You can see a depiction of Zeus on the right holding a lightning bolt. Zeus was the god of storms and thunder, as well as being king of the gods. Zeus's brothers were Poseidon and Hades. Poseidon was the god of the sea, but also of earthquakes and horses. Hades was a god of the underworld. He wasn't counted as one of the Olympians, but he was a very important god as ruler of the dead. And his wife was Persephone, a young maiden who he had kidnapped when she was basically unaccompanied by her mother, Demeter, goddess of grain. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, crafts, and warfare, also the patron god of the city of Athens. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty. Ares was the god of warfare. Hephaestus, the god of smiths. Apollo, the god of archery, music, and prophecy. Artemis, the goddess of hunting. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and Dionysus, the god of wine. And indeed, yes, there were others. So the ancient Greeks had a lot of gods, most of them associated with Olympus. Zeus is their king, but the independent gods had a lot of agency. They didn't just always follow along with whatever Zeus wanted. So Zeus wasn't thought of as like an all-powerful, all-knowing god, but rather just the first among equals. There were older generations of gods as well, such as the Titans and the goddess Gaia and Uranus, the god of the heavens, but those were less worshipped than the Olympians. The classical period of ancient Greece lasts from around the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, so the 500s to the 300s BC. Greece was politically divided in this time and consisted of around 160 independent city-states, most with a population of under 10,000, although there were larger and more powerful city-states such as Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. So there were usually many temples in each city. Some temples were actually also used as treasuries by the local government. Each temple was usually dedicated to one god or goddess. There's also these different orders of temple architecture. We see a gradual evolution of increasingly elaborate decoration from the simpler Doric to the more elaborate Ionic and Corinthian orders, respectively. But the point there, in part, is that the temples were kind of the artistic focus and hub of ancient Greek culture, not just religious. Rituals performed by the Greeks often focused on offerings, including libations or liquid offerings, such as pouring out wine into the ground, or animal sacrifice, as you can see from the painted ceramic vessel on the right, where a bull is being led to sacrifice before a statue of the goddess Athena. Vase paintings with temple scenes are most commonly depicting altars and sacrifices, as in this example. The Hellenistic period followed that of classical Greece, and it was initiated by the conquest of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. Macedon was a Greek-influenced kingdom to the north of the Greek city-states, which succeeded in unifying, creating a powerful army under Alexander's father Philip. And Alexander used that army first to conquer Greece and then to conquer the Persian Empire. And you can see from the map this would have been a huge swath of territory, most of the known world at the time. Before his death, Alexander actually got as far to the east as India. After his death, Alexander's empire quickly broke up, but it was largely divided among his generals who created successor kingdoms, such as the Ptolemy dynasty ruling over Egypt and nearby lands, and the Seleucids further to the east. Greek culture and religion spread to the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean during this period, and also to India and parts of Central Asia. Out of this mix of cultures, we get religious syncretism, which means combining gods or beliefs or practices from multiple religions. There were Persian deities who were worshipped by Greeks and often identified with a particular Greek god, Greco-Egyptian syncretism, and even combinations of Greek religion with Buddhism in India and Central Asia. Roman religion. Rome started as a republic in the Italian peninsula. You can see a map of Italy from around 400 BC, where the Romans actually control one of the smaller territories or kingdoms. And earlier in their history, they were largely in the shadow of the Etruscans to the north, partially influenced by their culture. There were also by this time extensive Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, which also exerted cultural influence on the Romans. Later on, the Romans were able to dominate militarily the other peoples of the Italian peninsula, and later still they spread out across the Mediterranean, forming the first empire to control all the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. You can see in this map from around 117 AD the territorial height of the Roman Empire. They controlled Egypt, Greece, parts of the earlier Persian Empire, and so on. Roman religion was focused on offerings such as animal sacrifice and oblations, similar in that regard to ancient Greek religion. You can see in this relief sculpture from the right a bull being led to the sacrifice, also a sacred fire altar. There were many different types of divination practice in Roman religion, and diviners were an important component of the class of priests. Priests were not always a full-time occupation. Some priesthoods, such as the Pontifex Maximus or high priest of the city of Rome, were political appointments given to up-and-coming politicians. The picture on the right is of the Emperor Augustus garbed as the Pontifex Maximus or high priest. Another important type of priest in ancient Roman religion were the Vestal Virgins. These were young women dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and while they served as priestesses, they would remain celibate. They would refrain from sexual activity. Many of them later on would retire from the priesthood, and then some of them would marry and have families. Augurs were the official diviners in Rome, or one of the class of diviners, and augury is divination based on observing the flight of birds. Another common method of divination in ancient Rome was haruspicy, or examining the livers of sacrificed animals. The picture on the right is called the liver of Pacienza. This is probably an Etruscan artifact originally, but used by Roman diviners called haruspexes, who divined by haruspicy, which is the examination of the liver of the sacrificed animal. And there were other methods of divination too, such as oracles. These would essentially be mystical revelations given to certain prophets, inspired or put into a frenzy, an altered state of consciousness by a god or goddess. Some of these, such as the Sibylline oracles, were collected into books that were read for wisdom by Romans. There were many Roman gods. The three main gods in the early form of the religion were known as the Capitoline Triad: Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Jupiter was the king of the gods and god of thunder. Juno was the queen of the gods, goddess of motherhood and wives. And Minerva was the goddess of crafts and knowledge. So this is a partial list of some of the Roman gods. Jupiter, as mentioned, was the king of the gods and god of thunder, very close to Zeus in his character. Indeed, the Romans later on identified a bunch of their gods with the gods of the Greeks. Juno, the goddess of wife and motherhood, so women who were pregnant or giving birth would often pray to Juno. Minerva, goddess of wisdom, justice, the law, and crafts. Neptune, god of the sea. Mars, god of war. Venus, goddess of love. Ceres, the goddess of grain. Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and Diana, goddess of the hunt. So Minerva was similar to the Greek goddess Athena. Neptune was similar to the Greek god Poseidon. Mars, similar to the Greek god Ares. Venus, to the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Ceres, to the Greek goddess Demeter. Vesta, to the Greek goddess Hestia. And Diana, to the Greek goddess Artemis. And Juno is similar to the Greek goddess Hera. The picture on the right shows the Roman hero Aeneas being healed by the mystically inspired diviner and healer Iapix. And the goddess Venus is looking on. Venus was regarded as an ancestor of Aeneas, and Aeneas as an ancestor of the Romans. So you can see some Roman rulers regarded themselves as descendant of Venus and regarded Venus as their kind of patron god. So I mentioned Aeneas. There were a whole bunch of mythical founders and heroes from the early history of Rome. Aeneas was supposedly a Trojan who sailed to Italy after the defeat of Troy in the Trojan War, but who ended up settling in Italy, and his descendants included Romulus and Remus. These were twins who were actually, when they were infants, nourished by a wolf, Luper, a she-wolf, and Romulus later went on to found the city of Rome. You can see in this relief sculpture on the right, at the top are Romulus and Remus walking. The bottom shows when they're young in a cave called the Lupercal, being nursed by the she-wolf Luper. And also in the bottom right, reclining, is Father Tiber, or Tiberinus, the god of the Tiber River, associated especially with the city of Rome. After the Romans conquered Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean, they equated many of their gods with those of the Greeks, and even borrowed Greek myths and stories to flesh out or develop the stories of their own gods. Romans also adapted particular Greek gods that were not originally a part of their religion, such as Asclepius, the god of healing. Asclepius, in particular, was worshipped during the midst of an epidemic because he was believed to have had the healing powers to cure people of the disease. Later on, after Julius Caesar and his successors established the imperial system of government, or the Roman Empire, there was what's known as the cult of the emperor. Caesar himself was deified or treated as a deity after his death in 44 BC, and this led to a long tradition of deified emperors, some of whom were treated as gods even while they were still alive. Later on, worship of the emperor as god was used as a sort of loyalty test to see if people would submit to the Roman authority. Romans also adopted foreign gods from various places, such as Cybele, a fertility goddess from Anatolia or Asia Minor, what's now Turkey, Isis, an Egyptian goddess, and Mithras, a Persian god who was sort of reinterpreted and made into his own thing with his own cult in later Roman religion. The picture on the right is of Mithras sacrificing a bull, which was a central image and myth in the Roman cult of Mithras. The origin of Mithras is a Persian word meaning friendship or fellowship or contract or covenant, but the interpretation of the Persian god became different in the Roman version. Roman religion gradually came to an end as Christianity spread throughout the empire. So Christianity dates to the 1st century AD. It was persecuted by the Romans for some time, but eventually started to spread, and it became a serious competitor with Roman paganism in the 4th century AD. You can see from the picture on the right a 3rd century AD Roman Christian stela or funeral monument. It has the initials DM on it, which stand for the Latin words Dies Manibus, or to the spirits of the manes. These are the spirits of the dead. What's interesting is that is a Roman pagan expression, but the fishes below and the word ichthus, which you can see there in Greek, those are actually Christian symbols. The Edict of Milan was issued by the Emperor Constantine the Great in 313 AD. This gave legal permission for Christians to worship throughout the empire. And Constantine, although he was born a pagan, he started promoting Christianity during his reign and was baptized on his deathbed. So he became, in effect, the first Christian emperor. And thereafter, after the Edict of Milan, Christianity, it ceased to be persecuted for the most part. It spread rapidly, and gradually Roman paganism mostly died out within the empire. There was one exception, the emperor, sometimes known as Julian the Apostate. Apostate means he abandoned Christianity and returned to paganism. He only ruled for a few years, though, from 361 to 363 AD. He tried to restore a new form of paganism and one kind of reorganized and made more systematic to make it more competitive with Christianity. But his efforts didn't outlast his rule, and thereafter paganism relatively quickly died out. There were some survivals, though, of the earlier Roman religion. For example, the title of Pontifex Maximus, or Supreme Priest, was adopted by the popes of Rome. The first one to do so was Pope Leo the Great, who reigned as pope from 440 to 461 AD. The persistence of ancient religions. For the most part, a lot of these ancient religions are just not practiced anymore, but there are some exceptions. For one thing, the death of paganism or non-Christian forms of polytheism and animism in Europe, the decline and death of those was a very gradual process. The parts of Europe around the Mediterranean, the parts that were in the Roman Empire and also Britain, were Christianized during the Roman period. But after that, it was a kind of gradual expansion into other Christian nations. Lithuania was the last main European country to remain pagan, and it didn't convert formally until the 15th century AD. And according to some scholars, they think that there were cults to pagan gods like Perkunas or Perkons, the god of thunder, that persisted in Latvia even up until the 1700s, or possibly traces of it until the 1800s. The exact details of this are kind of disputed. In the picture on the right, though, you can see a later depiction of the Prussian gods Pekos, Perkunas, and Potrimpo. This is nicknamed the flag of Widovuto. Zoroastrianism did survive. It was the main ancient religion of the Near East slash Mediterranean slash Southwest Asia that survived the later emergence of Christianity and Islam. As mentioned, Zoroastrianism, though, does have only very few devotees today. So in Mumbai or Bombay, India, and a few in Iran. There's also a small diaspora of Zoroastrians around the world. You can see in the picture on the right a Parsi or Zoroastrian initiation ceremony called the Navyote. There also are fragments of persistence of the ancient religions. Some European folk and Roman traditions were incorporated into Western Christianity. For example, some of the Christian festivals of the saints and so on. One possible example of this is just the name of the festival of Easter, which is usually called something related to Pascha or Paschal in most European languages, but in English, the name comes from an Old English or Anglo-Saxon goddess, Aostra or Ostara. Now, all we really know about the goddess Aostra is her name, so we don't really know for sure which parts, if any, of the Easter festival itself come from Aostra. Certainly, those parts of the Easter festival that are practiced outside of England are unlikely to come from an ancient English goddess. There has been speculation, though, that the Easter bunny is connected to the significance of rabbits or hares for the ancient goddess Aostra, but as far as I know, those are just speculations. They haven't been completely proven. There also was a persistence of pagan gods and spirits in folklore, literature, art, and more recently fantasy fiction, such as the figure Thor, the Old Norse, Old Germanic god of lightning and thunder. Nowadays, he's mostly known from his comic book version in the Marvel comics and films, which is much different from the original Old Norse or North Germanic version, but shares the name, shares the hammer, shares the connection with thunder. So there's at least some cultural continuity there. And arguably, stories about fairies, werewolves, vampires, at least some of these probably connect to ancient traditions about gods and spirits from pre Christian paganism in Europe. And more recently, since the 1960s especially, there's been a partial revival of some forms of European paganism. So the New Age movement included revivals of polytheistic religions like that of the Old Norse, the ancient Greeks, the Celts, Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and so on, and also of other religions like that of ancient Egypt. So some of these neo-pagans or modern pagans are only devoted to the gods of one of these ancient cultures, while others will worship gods from many cultures. There's, for example, a revival of Old Norse religion in modern Scandinavian nations like Sweden. We see here a modern altar to the god Freyr, a god of fertility, that was created in Sweden in the year 2010. You also see a hammer of Thor on the right and plenty of food and other offerings. That's it for this chapter, chapter 6, Ancient Religions. Next up, we're moving on to the second main part of the course on indigenous religions. This will cover, in survey, brief form, the religions of Africa and other indigenous cultures. Until next time.